Welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Bronson, and my job today is to be behind the scenes, kind of moderating the chat, and then I'll come back on at the end to help facilitate any questions. But you all are in for a real treat today because we have Sarah Mars from Awardco Center of Excellence, who is going to be giving you some really great research and great insights. So Sarah, let me turn that over to you. And please feel free to chat in before I hand it over to you, Sarah. Please feel free to chat. Tell us where you're viewing from. That's always kind of exciting to see where people are located. And then also, should there be any questions, Sarah and I both will be looking at that, but I'll be behind the scenes and come back on later. So Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, please take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bronson and Connor, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, maybe morning, afternoon. It's evening here in London where I'm based. Thank you for your time and for your attention over the next hour or so, or 50 minutes or so. And hopefully we'll make it a useful time for you, and you'll leave with some really clear practical takeaways and how to apply that to your recognition programs, or even just broadly thinking about employee motivation and engagement. So my name is Sarah Mars, as the team introduced, and I would call myself a pracademic. I try to bring science into the practical space, and hopefully that's what you'll walk away with a sense of today. So the presentation today is really going to be in three parts. We're going to talk about how recognition ignites motivation in employees. I think this is a really interesting piece of research that we ran earlier this year, and I'll be excited to talk you through how we really were able to tie recognition practices to almost a direct connection to employee motivation. We're going to talk about then some just practical recognition strategies that our research has proved is most effective. And we're going to end with maybe a slightly different spin on recognition, but we're doing some exploratory work into what meaning we can really gather from recognition data alongside all of the benefits that we know come from recognition in an organization. And I'll share some of our exploratory findings, and really interested to get reactions from this group. I can see lots of people posting in the chat. I'll be doing my best to monitor the chat. And if you do have questions as I go along, please feel free to throw them in. I'll also be opening the session today with a question, so I'd love for you to throw your thoughts into that chat there. And I'll do my best to monitor it. And then if anything I don't get to, Bronson will also be monitoring it, and we'll pick up questions at the end. So please do feel free to ask questions and interact as much as possible. All right, so I'm going to open up the first part of the session today with a question for all of you. So it'd be great if you could type your responses into the chat. And the question is, why do you make an effort at work? What is it that really drives you? You know, what makes you go above and beyond? What makes you really decide to put your head down and really push through and solve problems? Why do you make an effort at work? So just throw your answers in the chat. I'll wait to see them come through. There we go. Thank you, Erin. Feeling of accomplishment, really common one. Personal gratification, that's from Tracy. Yes, meaningful work, really, really important one. I always notice when I ask to be recognized as a stellar employee, so praise maybe. Oh, they're all coming through now. Upward mobility, career progression, caring about the team, fantastic, thank you. I always think it's funny when I ask this question. I do this presentation, I've presented at conferences, I ask this question, and nobody ever says money. But I think finance is somewhere in there, you know, material reward and monetary reward is something in there. Thank you for that. Feeling of accomplishment, appreciation, fantastic. This is a really important question that's really integral to understanding, you know, employee motivation at work, and it was the topic of our research. We ran a piece of research over summer. We gathered 2,000 responses. We looked for responses across the US and the UK, and we went out to 15 different industries. So we got a real broad spectrum of employee responses. And what we essentially did is we asked a number of questions that really tapped into why employees made an effort at work. And there was a specific reason why we focused on effort and not engagement. I've spent my career working in engagement. I'm obviously a huge believer in the power of employee engagement, but I think when it comes to getting traction with HR programs with engagement, One of the big challenges that we always have is everybody at this stage of the engagement industry, everybody has a slightly different definition of what they mean by employee engagement. So I can talk to business leaders, and some people think it equates to happiness. Some people think it talks about pride and a commitment to the organization. Some people think it's all about effort. There's sort of this energy. I've heard that definition. EMPS, throw in the chat if you measure EMPS in your organization. That's a sort of a new one that's cropped up that seems to be very, very popular. And the challenge with all of those things, and all of those things are relevant to measure, but when you have multiple different definitions of a single construct, it's very hard to get a grasp on it in organizations. So with this research specifically, we wanted to look at a topic that was just sort of very targeted, and that's why we decided to look at motivation. Why do you make an effort at work? Lots of different reasons went in the chat. That was something that we really wanted to investigate and find out in more detail. So we ran a big piece of research earlier this year over the summer to ask that very question. And what we did through that research is we identified 7 distinct motivators of why people make an effort at work. And I'll take you through each one of them. So the first motivator was material reward. Nobody said it on the chat. I don't tend to get that as a response when I present this presentation. Material reward is all about a feeling of greater job security. Maybe it's about having a more prestigious job title. I think I saw something in the chat about maybe progressing your career, and it's a little bit tied to that. Interestingly, it's not actually about money. It's not just purely about money. When we threw money in as a motivator into our model, it just didn't fit. It completely broke everything. And I think that the reason for that is financial reward specifically, and money is kind of tied to, it's a different dynamic that exists within people. It kind of depends on the job market. Maybe it depends on a number of different things, maybe your stage of life. So when we talk about material reward, it isn't just purely looking at baseline money. The second motivator that we found was expectations from people at work. So wanting to really avoid judgment, or maybe being criticized or judged critically by perhaps your manager, could be peers on your team, maybe it's a senior leader in the organization. So really just caring about what other people at work think of you, essentially. The third distinct motivator is very similar to, but distinct from, the expectations from people at work, and that is expectations from people in your personal life. So similarly, you want to avoid criticism or judgment, but this time it might be from people in your personal life. Could be a spouse, could be a family that's depending on you. Maybe you have a group of friends that you graduated from college with, and they're all high flying in their jobs, and you feel like you need to keep up. Maybe you have some pushy parents. It could be any number of things, but just really wanting to meet the expectations of people in your personal life. The next motivator is making a contribution. I definitely heard that in the chat. That is where you want to contribute to the efforts of your team. Maybe your team is really hardworking and you feel that you want to help them in their efforts, or maybe you feel that your work will really make a difference to helping your team achieve their broader goals. So it's really about that feeling of wanting to contribute and make a difference to your immediate team. Related to that, but slightly different, is ideology. I definitely saw this come up in the comments. It's a really common reason why people will cite why they do what they do, why they make an effort at work. This is where you really believe in the purpose of the organization, or you believe that the work that you do will make a difference. It does have a meaning. An interesting aspect of this is also that you feel that what you're learning on your job will progress you in your life. It's kind of you're learning skills that are aligned to the direction that you want to go to more broadly with your life. You feel like going to work is kind of a good investment of your time because it's taking you in a good life direction in terms of learning. Okay, nearly there. So the fifth motivator that we identified was achievement. This is where people just make an effort because they love doing hard things. They love meeting targets, hitting goals, doing difficult things, maybe creating new things that have never been created before. It's sort of the type of people who, if you just give them a target or a goal, they'll just run towards it. Really, really big motivator for people. And the final motivator is enjoyment. So when people find their work fun, find it interesting, it stimulates them. The feeling when you're at work and time just flies, you're in that real state of flow, it can be referred to as is really the sort of the enjoyment aspect of work. And so all of those 7 motivators were distinct motivators that we identified. I'll take a pause here just to say that if anybody did an organizational psychology class in your studies, you will probably recognize these as being familiar and related to self-determination theory. And that's exactly right. That is what we based this research on. So self-determination theory is a really, really well-proven, well-respected motivation theory, and it shows that there are sort of a number of different motivators that exist for people. And they exist really on 2 sort of broad spectrums. So on the left-hand side of that circle that you see, those are more external or extrinsic motivators. And on the right-hand side of that circle is more the internal or the intrinsic motivators. And what self-determination theory tells us is that, they both sort of have a part to play in motivation. They're both important to motivating employees. So that was the first part of our research, but the challenge with, and I find this really interesting, hopefully you find it interesting, the challenge with looking at motivation from this way is it kind of puts us all in a box. It kind of pigeonholes us to say, well, I'm motivated by, contribution, or I'm motivated by achievement. And there was actually a school of thought for a while that said that, it was better to focus on motivating people intrinsically, because, motivating people extrinsically is kind of seen as being maybe a little bit nefarious, or maybe it's just not as good quality, or it's just not a good way to motivate people. But actually what we wanted to do is take this research further and move a little bit more into, I guess, the messy reality that is human beings at work. And what we did is we actually wanted to acknowledge that these motivators can coexist within a single person. It is very possible for someone to be motivated very heavily by ideology, and also for that person to be very motivated by material reward, and that's okay. They are both sources of motivation that we can tap into if we want to unlock the potential of that person. If we're only unlocking the ideology and we're not unlocking the material reward, we're not capitalizing on all of the potential ways that we can motivate an employee. So that's where we went next with our research. So we actually did a cluster analysis, so a person-centered analysis, to look at how those 7 different motivators combine within an individual. And from that, we formed 5 distinct profiles. We call them motivation profiles. So the first profile was about 17% of our sample. This profile was actually actively demotivated. That is to say that none of those motivation circles actually fired up for that profile. They didn't care about the money. They didn't care about what other people thought of them. They didn't believe in the organization, didn't care about contributing to the team, just not in a great place all round, not enjoying their work, actively demotivated. And as I said, that was about 17% of our sample. The next cluster that we found was what I call the disconnected group. And what differentiates this group from the actively demotivated group was there was just a little bit of motivation firing up, specifically around the achievement and enjoyment. Not a lot, to be fair, but just a little bit, enough so that they weren't completely actively demotivated. They were a little bit motivated around, feeling like they were achieving things in their role and feeling like they enjoyed the work that they were doing. The next profile is where we really started to see levels of motivation, I would say, start to spike within our sample. And interestingly, this was the biggest group in our research. Just over a quarter of employees fell into this bucket. And this bucket of employees are motivated purely by the expectations and obligations that they feel that they have towards other people. It just goes to show how human beings are social creatures, and how kind of social pressure, maybe a healthy social pressure, can be such a valuable motivator for people. And this group specifically is the only thing that really got them to make an additional effort. Material reward, enjoyment, achievement, all of those not spiking, but the expectations of other people, colleagues or friends and family, really got them to make that additional effort. The fourth motivator that we saw, motivation profile that we saw, was what I call the bought-in profile. And this was nearly 20% of our sample. And what you'll notice about this profile is that they're a little bit opposite to the obligated group, in that it's all that kind of right-hand side of the circle that's fired up for them. So those are all of the intrinsic motivators, are the motivators that are spiking for this group. So not so much fussed about material reward, and they don't really care about what other people think of them, about sort of keeping up appearances or any of that, but they really believe in what they do, they enjoy what they do, they love contributing to their team, they feel a sense of achievement from it. So they're very intrinsically motivated generally. And it's not surprising that in this profile, we saw slightly more employees that sat in the not-for-profit sector or the government sector. And then finally, firing on all cylinders was the final profile that we identified. And it was a large part of the sample, just under a quarter, which is great. And this group are motivated by everything. They care about financial material reward, they care about ideology, they care about expectations, they enjoy their jobs. You know, they are really what we would call kind of fully motivated, firing on all cylinders employees. And if there's one thing I want to, I guess, leave this group with at this time, it's to say that it's not really a case that you should be, you know, expecting everybody in your organization to be firing on all cylinders. It's not really feasible, I guess, to get everybody, you know, 100% of your organization firing on all cylinders all the time. But what I hope that this research opens up is shining a light on the fact that within every employee that you have working in your organization, you have these 7 potential sources of effort that you could access. And the analogy I use is literally cylinders on an engine. And they represent a potential source of effort or power from that employee. So if you're only motivating that kind of right-hand side, all of the intrinsic motivators, that's great. It's better than having nothing fired up, but you're still missing other ways to motivate people. So when you're designing any HR strategy, you really want to be thinking about firing up all of those sources of effort, getting the maximum power and the maximum effort out of an employee. I apologize, by the way, since we moved to screen share, I can't see the chat anymore. So I am not going to be monitoring the chat, but I'll just trust Bronson to clue me in on any questions at the end. Okay, so those were the profiles that we found. The next question that we wanted to ask of our research was, okay, you know, what causes what? So I could see an argument that recognition would influence motivation profile. That's that top arrow layer that you see on the slide. But I could also absolutely see an argument that if I'm more motivated, if I am firing on all cylinders versus actively demotivated, I'm likely to get more recognition. So I could see an argument that my motivation profile is then going to cause an increase in recognition. And this is a really important question to ask as a social scientist when we're trying to understand cause and effect and essentially understand interventions in an organization. Full disclosure, when I first designed this research, I was expecting to see that motivation profile caused recognition, and that was what I designed this research for. What I actually found when I tested it was that recognition caused motivation profile. There is actually a relationship both ways, but the relationship of recognition causing motivation profile is much stronger than the relationship the other way. So recognition is the intervention that can change somebody's motivation profile. And that really threw me for a loop when I ran the research, because I was planning on a whole different story. I was planning on talking about how people's motivation profile is a bit more static and about how they like to be recognized in different ways. And then what I ended up with was a very different story where it didn't really make sense until I sort of flipped the way that the model worked and then looked at the impact of different types of recognition on that motivation profile. And luckily it still worked out, and I think we still have some really good findings from it, but there was definitely a few days where I was just wondering what on earth I had actually found out. So that leads to the next obvious question, right? What in recognition actually does influence that motivation profile? So we tested it. So what we did is we looked at our 5 different profiles, and then we looked at what are the recognition practices that these different employees in these profiles are experiencing, and what are there any differences in the recognition practices that they're following? And we found some quite interesting differences. So the first thing is in that actively demotivated profile, again, a bit of a surprising finding. I was expecting to find that the employees in this profile would be getting no recognition. That was my sort of going in hypothesis. What we actually found is that employees in that actively demotivated profile were getting recognition, but they were getting it in private one-on-ones, and they were getting it predominantly from their manager. So it was predominantly happening in a sort of a manager one-on-one existing cadence. And what this said to me is that delivering that recognition sort of in the flow of, your existing one-on-one in that private setting is actually just table stakes. It's actually not enough to move employees into, or to fire up that motivation in employees and move them into a different profile membership. It is not enough to fire up motivation. It's just a baseline expectation. You're my manager, I expect you to acknowledge my work when I do good work. What we then saw as we started sort of layering on and moving through different profiles and understanding how different types of recognition we're laying on is a little bit fuzzy, but we saw a broad trend towards layering on of other forms of recognition outside of manager one-on-ones. So this could be emails, it could be shout outs in a meeting, Slack Teams messages, so just other ways that people were getting recognition. And we also saw a broad layering on of that recognition coming from people other than the manager, so specifically from senior leaders and also from peers. But it wasn't really very concrete. It was a little bit sort of messy and fuzzy, but we just saw this sort of general addition of different types of recognition from more people. Then when we moved into our bought-in profile, that's where we saw a kind of a difference, and we saw a jump. And specifically, I thought this was interesting, we saw a jump in recognition being given in meeting shout-outs. And we saw a jump in recognition coming from not just the manager, but from senior leaders and peers as well, more consistently. So at the point where recognition just became a bit more public, and from not just your manager, who you might say is obliged in some way to give recognition, but from other people broader than the manager, that's where we saw people jump into that bought-in profile. And then the final step was when we saw people firing on all cylinders. The final sort of thing that seemed to tip them into that firing on all cylinders, which I thought was quite interesting, is the addition of instant messaging into the recognition channels. And instant messaging actually on its own, I'll talk a bit about this, but on its own has not proven to be a powerful form of recognition or a powerful kind of driver of engagement. Apologies. But when instant messaging is combined with all of the other types or all of the other ways to recognize people, it seems to nudge people into this firing on all cylinders category. And I wonder if part of the reason for that is because instant messaging is it's quite quick, it's quite informal. So by itself, it's sort of too light, or it doesn't feel meaningful enough. But added in as a layer, or as the small pebbles, should we say, among the big rocks of the recognition that's already existing, it feels like it just rounds out and supplements the recognition. Maybe it turns it into a day-to-day activity or more of an informal activity, and that seems to just create this like bump up in motivation and move people into that final profile. And then finally, the other sort of thing that we see consistently happening in that firing on all cylinders profile is that recognition is consistently coming from managers and peers and senior leaders. So this nice holistic group of people who are recognizing employees. So it's interesting. So we saw some real tangible differences in recognition program design and how it really fires up those different sources of effort in employees. And so this gives you some real concrete takeaways to think about if you really want to maximize your efforts from that recognition program. The other thing I'll touch on quickly is that people's redemption preferences actually also changed with their profile membership. So redemption preferences is when we ask people, what gift or what type of reward do you prefer to receive as a thank you for doing good work? And we asked them a different options. You can see on the slide the options that we asked. And I've just targeted those sort of extreme profiles, the actively demotivated and the firing on all cylinders. And you can see on the screen the difference in the redemption preferences. If you look at the actively demotivated, they just want gift cards. They just want, like, give me the cash, give me the money, give me the voucher. I just want you to cash me out. That's my main priority. If you look at the firing on all cylinders group, gift cards are still the biggest thing that they want, proportionally, it's still got the most preference, and gift cards and vouchers are a hugely important part of a reward strategy. Having this sort of flexible spending option where people can just cash out the reward is incredibly important. So I'm absolutely not saying to lose that, but you can also see that they are looking for different types of rewards from their employers. They're looking for maybe team activities, company swag, spikes their personal gifts, like much more of a personalized reward. So it's just interesting to see that redemption profile change. And if I just fill in the rest of the slide, you can sort of see that downward trend of the gift card prevalence in terms of what people want from their employer. Okay, so that was the sort of part one of our research where we talk about motivation. We talk about how recognition fires up motivation. I'm going to then go through some relatively quick fire insights, because I think it's always useful to have takeaways from webinars like this, just some real concrete things that you can take away to feed maybe into your recognition program design and what we found works from our research. So when it comes to designing a recognition program, you really have 4 main levers to play with and configure when you're putting a program out there. The first is the mode. So that's how you mainly want recognition to be distributed. You can see there I've listed the ones that we tested, and certainly the most common ones that we see. So delivered one-on-one, in an email, meeting, shout out, company award. That's where you might have a special annual award for really outstanding employee performance. Sometimes that's peer nominated, and a recognition platform is in there as well. We also tested birthdays and service anniversary awards, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we found about their impact. Then we tested who people are receiving recognition from. So specifically, we asked them if it's from their manager, peer, or senior leader. We tested the frequency of recognition. So we tested from weekly, as often as weekly, all the way through to annually. And finally, we tested different reward options that were available to people that I discussed on the last slide. You can see them written down here. So we sort of threw all of these recognition configuration levers into a model, and then we measured subsequent engagement, well-being, inclusion, intent to stay with the organization, just tried to understand what kind of configurations had the best subsequent impact on those employee outcomes. So let's start with mode. So what you're seeing here is people's responses to the question, in the last 3 months, how have you been recognized for good work? So what are the most common ways that people are recognized for good work? And you can see from the chart, the sort of frequency of responses. They will add up to more than 100% because it was a multi-select question, so people could select more than one answer. And you can see here from the chart, a private one-on-one conversation is by far the most common way that people receive recognition, followed by, I would say, broadly speaking, a shout out in a meeting and an email from their manager, and then broadly speaking, followed by Slack or Teams message, company award, or a recognition platform. So those are the most common ways that people receive recognition, but are they the most effective? Does the most common way align with the most effective way? And essentially what we found is that the mode of recognition that has the highest impact is a company award. So this will be your really special award that you reserve for a handful of employees, or maybe even just one employee a year, for really outstanding work or an outstanding contribution to the company. And it makes sense. It makes sense that the effects of this would be longest lasting. This had a really significant impact on intent to stay, on engagement, on inclusion, on well-being. Of course, that makes sense. If somebody is recognized by the company, by their peers, by senior leaders, maybe there's a big ceremony, they might get a badge or trophy. It makes sense that that would then have a big subsequent impact. So it's good to know that those programs do have the desired impact, and they do have an outsized impact on those employee outcomes. At the same time, they're designed in their nature to be scarce, right? You're not by design going to give them to a large group of employees. So it's a sort of a narrow, focused impact of engagement that you're directing really that company award to, is a thank you to a very small cohort of employees. What I thought was really interesting is that when we tested a Slack or Teams message alone, there was no impact. So as I mentioned in the motivation profiles research, we found that Slack or Teams messages nudged people up into that firing on all cylinders category. So it had an impact there, but it was when it was used as a supplement to all of the other different recognition types. As a standalone, it has no subsequent impact on those employee outcomes. It was the only mode of recognition that had no subsequent impact on employee outcomes. So definitely something to think about when you're building Slack or Teams into your programs. You know, if you're using a recognition platform which has a Slack and Teams integration, that's a great way to replicate the convenience of instant message, whilst also maybe making sure that recognition is still public and can still be viewed by a number of different people across the organization. The other thing that we tested was birthday and service awards. So I feel like these charts tell the story. So the blue bars here are the percentage of people who said yes, they did get a service award, or no, they didn't. And you can see for service awards, it's about 50%, 50-50 said they did or they didn't get a service award on a milestone anniversary. And then on the right hand side is similar for birthday awards. So they're less common, about 40-60%. 40% of people do get some sort of birthday awards, 60% of people do not. But then look at those red bars. Those red bars are the engagement scores for people who do get a length of service award versus don't, and birthday award. And the difference is staggering. It just really tells its own story. About 25-30 point difference between those two options of whether people get do or don't get a birthday or service anniversary award. I personally am not a birthday person, so I was really surprised to see that it means so much to people when they get recognized for their birthday, which is something that everybody gets once a year. It's not even really a special thing that you do. But I think what it is it's just creating that opportunity for connection. It's just making space for a person for 10 minutes of a day once a year, right, where they can just read all these nice recognition or birthday messages that people send them, or a birthday card, or whatever it might be. Just, a note to say, I'm grateful you're here. Grateful you're here. Happy birthday. Have a great day. It actually has a really big knock-on effect if you scale that out through an organization. And if you consider this free to do, I think it feels like it's a no-brainer for organizations to consider. Okay, what about the who and the when? So we'll mix these together. So who's giving the recognition and how often are they giving it? A couple of interesting takeaways we found here. The first is that recognition from senior leaders, as you might expect, has the most impact out of any other type of giver in the organization. Recognition from managers, to put it into comparison, has about half the impact as recognition from senior leaders. So both are impactful, both are important, but senior leader recognition about twice as powerful on subsequent impact on engagement and other employee sentiment outcomes. Interestingly, peer-to-peer recognition, so recognition from peers, does not have a subsequent impact on engagement, on inclusion, or on intent to stay, but it did have a positive impact on well-being. So getting that peer recognition is still really important to people, but it's important to them. It sort of taps into something else in employee sentiment. It's about that well-being. It's about feeling like you are part of this organization. You feel confident in yourself. You feel you have trusted relationships, which is so important to our well-being at work. So not necessarily engagement, but certainly employee well-being is impacted by peer recognition. And then what this graph shows, and what I think is quite interesting that we found, is that the shelf life of recognition varies. So there is no such thing as too much recognition. There isn't really a saturation point where people go, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of all this recognition and now my engagement is going to dip. That doesn't happen. It plateaus, but it doesn't dip. But there is a shelf life for recognition. So for manager recognition, when employees received that less than every 3 months, we saw their engagement levels drop off. So they could get it, as long as they got it every 3 months, engagement levels would sustain. And then when they hit that 3-month mark, it would drop off. For senior leader recognition, that effect lasted up to a year. So when we say senior leader recognition is twice as important as manager recognition, it is, but the good news is they need to deliver it less frequently. So as long as senior leadership recognition is received up to once a year. It's after that, when we hit lower than a year, that we see those engagement levels drop off. And so it's worth bearing that in mind, particularly that quarterly recognition from a manager, worth trying to build that into your recognition programs, and thinking about whether that sort of annual cadence from a senior leader for recognition is something you could also think about factoring in as well. And finally, reward options. So we asked people what type of gift they preferred to receive as a thank you for good work. These were the options that they said. Some more interesting findings here. So similarly, it was a select all question, so there's going to be scores that add up to more than 100%. You can see that about 3/4 of employees said gift cards. So these were gift cards or vouchers, essentially a sort of a cash option that employees can just spend on whatever they want. That actually jives with what we see in our redemptions at Awardco. So we see about 3/4 of employees will choose gift cards as a redemption option as well. Very, very popular option, and really important to maintain as an option in your recognition programs. It is what employees want. Below that, experiences in travel, personalized gifts, and you can see activities or outings or company branded items. What's interesting about this is when we tested the impact of those redemption preferences on subsequent engagement, the items with the highest subsequent impact on engagement were company branded items or team activities, which does make sense. So wearing, maybe wearing a jacket or a hat or a t-shirt with your company logo on, or rucksacks, obviously very popular, water bottles, all of those sorts of things do help to foster a sense of connection with employees. Team activities and outings, I feel that that's quite self-explanatory how that would also help to foster a subsequent sense of engagement. So the takeaway from this is, and I should add, the gift cards actually were associated with a small negative impact on engagement. So they certainly did not have a positive impact on engagement. What does this mean in terms of a takeaway? It doesn't mean throw gift cards out of your catalogue. That would not be a good idea. It is what employees want, and it's important to give them what they want and give them the option for that spending. But reserve some budget, if you can, for items that will also serve the employer and serve to benefit the employer-employee relationship. So gift cards are all for the employee. It's important just to reserve some budget and reserve some items in your catalogue for items that will also act as a benefit to that employer-employee relationship in the longer term. Okay, so that was the end of part 2. How am I doing for time? Okay, I'm good. So what we wanted to end on today was a little bit of a look at some forward-thinking work that we're doing. So I'm working with our machine learning team in our product organization, and they design all of the fantastic software products that we create at Awardco, and working with them to really understand whether there's more that we can harness from recognitions. And one of the things I want to present to you is how we see recognition as being a representation of culture, and recognition is almost leaving a trail of what we call cultural footprints of what the organizational culture is. So I'm going to share these with you. They're a little bit exploratory. We're still trying to figure out the best way for customers to really make use of this and productize this, but I think the findings are really interesting, and in the spirit of transparency, I think it's great to show you these findings and what we're exploring right now. All right, so when somebody leaves a recognition, some of you will be very familiar with this, but somebody will write a recognition about an employee. They'll probably write a short sentence about why they're leaving that recognition. They will post that recognition, and then the employee will see that recognition in their feed. And over time, that will add up to a broad sum of recognition. And we've just spent, half an hour talking about all of the positive benefits that happen in the moment when that employee receives that recognition. So there is a lot of positive benefits to recognition, full stop, even if you don't harness anything else from it. But once you have all of these recognitions gathered over time, what else can it tell you about the organization? And what I propose, what I think it could tell us about the organization, is really giving us a snapshot of cultural artifacts. So another one that you may have seen in any psychology classes that you may have taken as part of your HR training. You may be familiar with Edgar Schein's model of organizational culture. It's very cited. Most HR consultants at some time have presented a slide with this iceberg on. And really, Schein's model of culture says that, way, way, way below the surface of organizational culture live the assumptions that exist in the company, but they are deep-seated, implicit beliefs. They're not going to be articulated. It'd be very hard to scratch and really see the assumptions. They live way below the surface. Built on top of assumptions are cultural values. Cultural values are a little bit easier to see, so they're a bit closer to the surface. You might get to learn an organization's cultural values after you've been there maybe a year or 2 years. So when you've spent some time really embedding in the company and you really start to understand the way things are done around here, you'll start to sort of get a sense of these common values that exist, that drive maybe why people behave they do in the company. And the final piece of culture is just the piece that lives above the surface that we can see, that we can observe, and that's cultural artifacts. And cultural artifacts are all of the things that we can observe that tell us about an organization's culture. It's the tone of voice people use in their emails. It's how late people stay in the office. It's how people behave, how managers behave, how leaders behave. Could even be the cultural values that are written up on the wall, or the branding that's used, or the employee value proposition. Those are all examples of cultural artifacts. And what I think is interesting about recognition is I think that we could see recognition as being a cultural artifact, because recognition tells us what happened in an organization. It tells us a behavior that happened in a company, and it also tells us a behavior that somebody in that company chose to highlight. So it tells us a little bit about what was sort of highlighted and extracted in an organization. So how can we actually turn a recognition into a cultural artifact? It's a long, complex process, but to simplify it, really oversimplify it, we went and we started with a very high quality training data set that was thousands of recognitions from hundreds of different employees, obviously completely anonymized. Our team then went through a manual human labeling exercise, so looking for agreement of where multiple different separate labelers had aligned on the label or the tag that they'd given each recognition. The results of that exercise went into the initial training of our recognition theme model, and then it is just a case of continuing to process, refine the results, rinse and repeat. It is just a case of putting more data in the model and allowing that to be refined. We have just released a V1 of that model, and from there we will be gathering more data, and from there we will be looking to enhance and make improvements to that model. So very much a work in progress, as it should be. Here's a little example of how it looks. So you might have a recognition that's left, and then from that recognition, we can tag different artifacts. So what does this actually look like in terms of how it manifests? So we actually ran this process on a number of different customers and Awardco, but I can only share the Awardco results with you. So that's what you're seeing here. So right here, you can see Awardco themes from the last 3 years, and you'll see that the number one theme that is tagged for Awardco is customer focus, all the way down through to safety. And the first thing that I saw when I saw this was, okay, this is, interesting, but I don't think it's really adding value. There's the so what, it's missing the so what. Where I think this view of data gets quite interesting is where we can look at how our cultural artifacts at Awardco are different from other organizations. So we have a number of other organizations who are also running these recognition themes, and now we can see where Awardco's responses differ from those other organizations. And this is where it starts to suddenly get much more interesting, because we see a variance in those scores. We see a very different story, where we saw customer focus was our highest before. Now it's actually showing up as the least relative to other organizations. Where I think this could be really interesting, and we're not there yet, our comparison group for here is still not quite right, because our comparison group here contains consumer-facing organizations, so end customer-facing organizations. And you would expect customer focus to be a much bigger push for those organizations. So I think the next stage for us with this is to start to really put like-for-like companies together and then look at how those cultural artifacts differ and start to get an understanding from there as to where action needs to be taken. I can think of manufacturing organizations, for example, would be very interested in understanding how their safety cultural attribute differed to other manufacturing organizations. So that's one way to look at it. The other view that I think gets quite interesting is when we take a longitudinal view. So now you can see the same data and it's broken out over time. And this is just zooming in on one attribute, that is the cultural attribute of inclusion. And you can see how this data is sort of mapped over time. The first thing you see when you look at this chart is, okay, there's like a super wiggly line just going up and down. But broadly speaking, if I add in a broad trend line on here, you could say, okay, broadly speaking, it's trending up, getting better. Okay, again, it's kind of interesting, but it's not groundbreaking and it's probably not going to change anything that we do other than go, okay, interesting. Again, where it gets interesting is where we start to put a comparative point in. So I've actually added a marker into this slide, and that marker is March 2023. And in March 2023, Awardco HR team implemented a big organization-wide policy, and that policy was return to office. So return to office was implemented in March 2023. And now when we put that line in the sand, all of a sudden we can see a very different story that comes out of that same data set. We can see that that HR policy had a significant effect on the inclusion marker moving forward. And it's not just inclusion. We see it for collaboration, similar story. It's not quite as marked for collaboration, but we saw a similar pattern for collaboration. And the last cultural attribute I will share is performance and accountability, because I think this one is really interesting and keeps the debate live and kicking on whether return to office is a good thing or a bad thing for an organization. If I add the same marker line for return to office into the graph and then look at that change over time, you can see that there is no significant change in job performance and accountability from before return to office to after return to office. So I think it maybe just goes to show that it's all about what different cultural attributes do you want to drive with your HR policy. But I think what this view gives us is a way to maybe quantify whether those attributes are in fact being driven, whether the policies we're implementing are having the effect that we want. Okay, right, I've talked for a lot. Closing thoughts, just to sum up all of that. The number one thing is don't undervalue recognition, and it doesn't have to be monetary reward recognition. Think about all of those different types of motivation that you can tap into for employees and how we can see that recognition unlocks those different types of motivation. So think about when you're designing your recognition program, when you're thinking about a recognition program, really you're trying to unlock all of those different types of motivation. It is such a direct connection to unlocking those motivators. It's incredibly powerful. The other thing I want to add is think about your recognition programs in terms of big rocks and small pebbles. So it's about the big, huge company awards, right? Very public. That's your huge rocks, down to your public shout outs in a meeting or public forums, down to your one-on-ones, and then down to the day-to-day Slack messages, instant messages, Teams messages, really big rocks and small pebbles. That's how you'll get the maximum impact and get employees firing on all cylinders from your recognition. I want to say hit those frequency thresholds. 3 months for managers, 1 year for senior leaders. Really try and hit those frequency thresholds. If you miss them, that's where you're likely to see a drop off in employee sentiment. And if you do choose to use a recognition platform, there's a few reasons to do it. Recognition can be given in so many different forms. There are a few benefits to a recognition platform, obviously the points aspect, the facilitation, but the other is that it can unlock meaningful data mining. So all of the slides that I showed on that impact of HR policy and intervention, all of that is just a byproduct of good recognition stuff that's happening on the platform. So that's really it. I'll pop over to the chat now and see if any questions have come through. My LinkedIn details are up there. Please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments or anything on the research. I'm so happy to talk about this further.
Sarah, thank you so much for that. And thank you for your patience as we work through some of those technical difficulties. Really appreciate that. We do have time for maybe one or two questions.
Okay.
And we got one from Laura in the chat. She says, does the safety artifact also include psychological safety, not just physical?
Great question. It was actually just physical in this example, but there's no reason why we couldn't create another artifact that was psychological safety. It's just in our sort of initial model, training model, we just focused on physical safety.
Amazing. Thank you. And I think maybe one more question before we pass it back to Connor. But in your research or in your opinion, do you feel like organizations of different sizes have different results with recognition programs?
It's a good question. We actually found one of the things I think is quite interesting is to sort of debunk a lot of the myths that exist around recognition. For example, a classic one is that young people, like really always on recognition, and older people traditional forms of recognition. Actually, what we found is that the rules of motivation and the rules of recognition are pretty universal. So you can generally apply everything that I've said. You can pretty broadly apply it across organizations.
I love that. Thank you. Any final thoughts or parting thoughts for our viewers on your research and everything you found over the last several months?
Only to say that I'm always interested in feedback and opinions and thoughts and whether this stuff resonates in the real world. I think that it's really easy to talk at a screen for 50 minutes and sound really knowledgeable about what I do, but the real impact is whether there's actually something applicable. The reality of being in HR and organizations is a whole different ballgame, right? And so things may seem very concrete and black and white in the research space, and we can quantify it down to numbers, but actually putting that into place in reality is a whole different story. So I would just love to hear from anyone who's working on these types of programs, to hear how this has resonated. What do you think would really just not work, not jive? Because that's how we can sort of try and find some happy middle ground, between those two places. So that would be my only parting thought.
I love that. Thank you so much. And thank you again for your expertise. Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.